They put him in the back of the patrol car at 5:17 p.m. on a Tuesday in September in the parking lot of the Meridian Professional Center on Peachtree Dunwoody Road in Sandy Springs, Georgia. While the building's glass doors were still catching the last of the afternoon light, and the cleaning crew for the fourth floor had not yet arrived. He had been walking to his car. That was the entirety of it. He had been walking across 41 feet of asphalt from the building's lobby entrance to his car. A 2020, one Lexus GS 350 in slate gray, parked in spot 14C, a reserved spot with his name on the placard. Carrying a leather messenger bag on his left shoulder and his phone in his right hand, Ane had been on a call with his assistant when the two patrol cars pulled in from the Glenridge connector and the officers got out. There were two of them. Officer Marcus Del Rey, 8 years with the Sandy Springs Police Department, and Officer Jonathan Fettel, 4 years with the same department. Officer Del Rey told him to stop. He stopped. Officer Del Rey told him to put his phone down. He ended the call and put his phone in his jacket pocket. Officer Fettel asked him what he was doing in this parking lot. He said he worked in the building. Officer Fettel asked, which company? A-Side Meridian Forensic Associates, Suite 410. Officer Del Rey said they had received a report of a suspicious individual in the lot and that he fit the description. A asked what the description was. Officer Del Rey said that was not information he was authorized to share at this time. A asked whether he was being detained. Officer Del Rey said yes. A asked on what basis. Officer Fettel said he was being detained pending verification of his identity and his stated purpose in the lot. A said he could go upstairs and show them the office. Officer Fettel said that would not be necessary and told him to turn around. He turned around. The handcuffs went on at 5:19 p.m. A woman on the third floor of the Meridian Professional Center saw it happen. She was a paraleg named Ades Owusu, who had been working late on a brief and had stood up to stretch and was looking at the parking lot through the floor-to-ceiling windows when the patrol cars came in. She watched the whole thing. The stop, the phone, the question about the company, the turn, the handcuffs. And she did not look away. She took her own phone out and filmed 11 seconds of it before the angle was blocked by the patrol car door. Those 11 seconds would matter later, but not in the way she expected them to. What was already going to matter more than any 11 seconds of footage was something that existed in a set of files on the fourth floor of that building, in a server room that was locked with a keypad code that only 4 people in the building knew, and one of them was currently sitting in the back of a patrol car in the parking lot below. His name was Kwadwo Osei Mensah. He was 47 years old, 162 pounds. Ane had the hands of someone who had been sitting at a desk with documents for 22 years. Not soft hands, exactly, but hands that knew their work was done through precision rather than force. Hands that moved through spreadsheets and ledgers and audit trails the way a surgeon's hands move through something delicate that cannot be damaged on the way to the truth. He had been born in Kumasi, Ghana in 1977. The third child of a civil servant father and a schoolteacher mother who had brought the family to Atlanta in 1990 when Kwadwo was 13 years old, settling in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Mechanicsville neighborhood of southwest Atlanta. His father had taken whatever work was available, 3 years of warehouse inventory, 2 years of taxi driving, 1 year of night shift security at a Marietta manufacturing plant while studying for the American accounting credentials, that finally, in 1997, gave him a position at a small firm in Midtown. His mother had her Ghanaian teaching qualifications assessed, found them partially recognized, taken the additional certification courses required, and been standing in front of a 4th-grade classroom at Hutchinson Elementary on McDaniel Street. By 1994, they had never complained about any of it in Kwadwo's presence. They treated the work as the work, which was the thing they had to do before they could do the thing they had come to do. And they did it without editorializing. Kwadwo had watched this for 7 years and understood. By the time he enrolled at Morehouse College in 1995, on a partial merit scholarship and a $4,200 annual loan that he was paying back, until 2000, exactly what kind of thing he was willing to be. He had studied accounting because his father understood numbers, and because Kwadwo had noticed, by the age of 16, that numbers did not lie in the way that words could. Numbers had a specific relationship to truth. when you followed them carefully enough all the way through, they showed you where the money had actually gone, which was often different from where the document said it had gone, which was always interesting and sometimes important. And occasionally, if the numbers were large enough and the institution powerful enough, genuinely dangerous to the person doing the following. He had understood this abstractly at 16. By 2004, A understood it specifically. When a financial audit A conducted at 32 years old for a small municipal water authority in Clayton County revealed a misappropriation of $820,000 that led to the resignation of 2 officials and the repayment of funds that had been missing from the public account for 4 years. He had never forgotten how that felt. Not the recognition, not the outcome, but the moment when the numbers closed and the picture was complete and what had been hidden was visible. A founded Meridian Forensic Associates in 2019 with 3 people, a leased office, and a business model that most accountants he knew considered either courageous or inadvisable. It would work exclusively on public sector engagements, exclusively on institutional financial crime, and exclusively when retained by a government authority rather than a private interest. A had turned down 4 private sector clients in the firm's first year, each of whom had offered fees that would have changed his cash flow situation considerably. A had turned them down because he had decided at the founding that the firm's purpose was the reason for the firm, and that accepting work outside the purpose was the beginning of not having one. A wore a dark charcoal jacket and dark gray trousers. That Tuesday, not a suit in the formal sense, but a combination his mother would have called putting yourself together correctly, which was her phrase for the standard of dress that said you took yourself seriously enough to take your work seriously. The jacket was from a small tailor on Piedmont Road, who had been making him 2 pieces a year for 6 years, and who charged him less than the market rate because he liked Quadwo's posture. The leather messenger bag on his left shoulder was worn at the strap junction from 4 years of daily use. A had bought it at a market stall in Accra during a family visit in 2019, the year he founded the firm. It had been $22, and it still worked, and he had not replaced it because it worked, and because replacing things that still worked was a habit of mine he did not want to cultivate. Inside the bag were 3 things that mattered: his laptop, the printed summary pages of the Sandy Springs engagement's working draft, and a navy blue notebook, hardcover, 200 pages, the same brand he had been using since 2001, in which he kept the handwritten record of every engagement, every evidentiary thread, every anomaly he found. The notebook for the Sandy Springs engagement was on its 4th volume. Volume 4 had 167 pages of entries. The last entry, made that afternoon at 4:43 p.m., read, "Server backup confirmed 4:58. Final section review complete. Report structurally sound. 11 days." A was a licensed forensic accountant and the founder and principal investigator of Meridian Forensic Associates, a 6-person firm that specialized in one specific category of financial crime: the financial examination of public institutions, government agencies, and law enforcement organizations suspected of misappropriating public funds. He had been retained 14 months ago by the Georgia Attorney General's Office under a sealed engagement letter to conduct a forensic review of the financial records of the Sandy Springs Police Department's discretionary asset forfeiture fund, a fund that had received $4.7 million over the previous 6 fiscal years and whose disbursement records contained 291 line items that could not be traced. To any documented departmental purpose. He had been on the phone with his assistant at the precise moment the patrol cars pulled into the lot, discussing the completion timeline for the final report. The report was due to the Attorney General's office in 11 days. The patrol car that held him sat in the parking lot for 17 minutes while Officer Del Rey ran his identification. His driver's license came back clean. His criminal history came back empty. Not a single charge, not a single arrest, not a parking ticket outstanding. Nothing. Officer Del Rey ran it a second time. The second result was identical to the first. He conferred with Officer Fettel outside the car for 4 minutes. Then Officer Del Rey opened the back door and told Quadwo that he was going to be transported to the Sandy Springs precinct for further questioning. Quadwo said, through the open door, that he had rights that entitled him to know the specific basis for his continued detention, that he had produced his identification and it had come back clean. and that transporting him to a precinct without a specific articulable basis was an unlawful detention. Aside all of this in the level-specific language of a man who has read enough court records in 14 months to know the precise vocabulary. Officer Vettel told him that providing legal commentary was not going to improve his situation. Quadvo said he was not commenting on his situation. He was informing the officers of his legal rights and intended to continue doing so. He was transported to the precinct at 5:36 p.m. Adaez Ouso watched the car leave from the third-floor window. She stood there for a moment. Then she went to the fourth floor and knocked on the door of Suite 410. The door to Suite 410 was locked. Adaez had seen the man. She recognized him because she worked in the building and had passed him in the lobby and in the elevator and at the coffee cart on the ground floor for the past 2 years. And she did not know exactly what he did on the fourth floor, but she knew he worked there, and she knew what she had just watched from the third floor. And she knew that watching and doing nothing was a choice she was not willing to make at 5:22 p.m. on a Tuesday. She went back to her desk and looked up the building directory. The listing for Suite 410 had a general office number and a name, Meridian Forensic Associates, and nothing else. She called the general number. It went to voicemail. She left a message that said, "I work in this building. I saw what happened in the parking lot. I filmed part of it. I want to help if I can." She left her number. Then she sent the same message as an email to the address on the voicemail recording. She sat back at her desk and looked at the brief she had been working on and did not work on it. The parking lot below her window was quiet now. Spot 14C was empty. The late September light was going flat against the glass. She had 11 seconds of footage on her phone and a voicemail left on an office line, and no certainty that any of it would reach anyone in time for it to matter. That is what it felt like to be Adaez Owusu at 5:40 p.m. on a Tuesday in September. Not like someone who had done something, but like someone who had done the only small thing available and was now waiting to find out if small things were enough. If this story is already pressing on something in your chest that you recognize, stay with me. Because what happens in the next 40 minutes and in the 11 days after that is not something the two officers who drove out of that parking lot had thought through carefully enough. She did not know that the voicemail and the email would both be retrieved within 47 minutes by a woman named Nana Adeyemi, Quadwo's operations director, who had been driving back from a client meeting in Buckhead when her phone began receiving notifications and who pulled over on Roswell Road at 5:58 p.m. to read them. Nana had worked with Quadwo for 9 years, through 2 previous firms and the founding of Meridian, and she had a very specific and practiced understanding of what the combination of Tuesday afternoon, Sandy Springs Precinct, and a call she had already been unable to reach him on meant. She called 3 numbers. The first was the Atlanta field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where she asked for Special Agent in Charge Deborah Asante, who was the supervising agent on the active engagement between the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and the Georgia Attorney General's office, an engagement that had been running parallel to Quadwo's forensic review for the past 8 months, that Quadwo knew about, and whose existence was the reason the engagement letter had been sealed. The second call was to the Georgia Attorney General's personal cell phone. The third was to Quadwo's attorney, a woman named Pauline Achebe, who had an office on Pryor Street in Atlanta, who picked up on the second ring, said she was already on her way, and was walking through the Sandy Springs precinct towards 6:31 p.m. Quadwo had been sitting in an interview room at the Sandy Springs precinct since 6:04 p.m. The room was 9 feet by 11 feet, with a table bolted to the floor, 2 metal chairs, a wall-mounted camera in the upper right corner whose red recording light was off, and a fluorescent fixture overhead that buzzed at a frequency that reminded him, in a specific and unhelpful way, of the fluorescent in the break room at his first job at a tax consultancy in Decatur in 2002. He had been offered water once. He had accepted. He had drunk approximately half of it and set the cup in the center of the table and folded his hands on the tabletop and waited. He had been in rooms before that were designed to make him feel small, and he had learned across 47 years to do one specific thing in those rooms: think. He did not pace. He did not perform distress. He sat with the leather messenger bag on the floor beside his chair. They had not asked him to surrender it, which told him something about the speed and confidence with which this had been organized. and he thought methodically about the 291 line items, about the 11 days remaining, about the specific sections of the final report that he had reviewed on the screen that morning and not yet formally saved to the secured server. He thought about the call he had been on when the patrol cars arrived. His assistant would know, from the abrupt end of that call, that something had happened. His assistant's name was Gerald Nwasu, 26 years old, 2 years out of Georgia State, with a forensic accounting degree, meticulous and unflappable. And currently, Kwadwo was confident, already doing exactly what the situation required. Gerald had, in fact, already done 3 things by the time Pauline Achebe walked through the precinct door. He had called Nana, he had emailed the contact at the Attorney General's office, and he had, following the specific protocol that Kwadwo had established on his second week at the firm and reviewed with him every 6 months since. The protocol that began with the words, "If I am unreachable and the situation is abnormal, log into the secured server remotely and verified that the working files for the Sandy Springs engagement were intact, backed up to the offsite server at 4:58 p.m. that afternoon, and inaccessible to anyone without the passphrase that only Kwadwo and Nana held. The files were intact. The report was safe. The 11 days were still available." Pauline Achebe was 52 years old and had been practicing criminal defense and civil rights law in Atlanta for 24 years. She wore her hair natural, close-cropped, and she carried a briefcase that was older than some of the associates at her firm, and that had on its front left corner a small brass plate engraved with her mother's initials. Her mother had been a lawyer too, in Lagos, in an era when that required a particular kind of stubbornness. She walked into the Sandy Springs precinct with the particular quality of motion that belongs to someone who has walked into precincts before and is not interested in the building's opinion of her. Arribal. She was in the interview room with Kwadwo at 6:33 p.m. She reviewed the situation in 7 minutes. She came back out and told the duty sergeant that her client had committed no offense, had produced clean identification, had a verified place of business at the address he provided, and that the department had 45 minutes to produce a specific articulable legal basis for continued detention or release him immediately. The duty sergeant said he would need to confer with the supervising officer on the call. Pauline said 45 minutes was now 44. The supervising officer was a lieutenant named Glenn Tabor, 14 years with the Sandy Springs Department, who had authorized the transport from the parking lot and who, when the duty sergeant knocked on his office door at 6:41 p.m., with the news that a lawyer was outside demanding release, and the clock was running, understood immediately that the arithmetic of the next 44 minutes was not in the department's favor. He authorized the release. At 6:49 p.m., Kwadwo walked out of the Sandy Springs precinct. At 6:52 p.m., with Pauline beside him and his messenger bag on his shoulder, and the half cup of water he had not finished, still on the bolted table in the 9-by-1 room. He did not give a statement to anyone outside that precinct. He got into Pauline's car. He asked her to drive him back to Meridian Professional Center. She drove him. He went upstairs, unlocked suite 410, sat down at his desk, and worked until 11:40 p.m. He filed the report to the Georgia Attorney General's office. 9 days later, 2 days ahead of the deadline. The report was 341 pages long. It documented, with full evidentiary sourcing, the disbursement of $2.3 million from the Sandy Springs Police Department's discretionary asset forfeiture fund across 6 fiscal years into 4 categories of expenditure. That had no legal basis, no documented authorization, and no record in the public accounts. $780,000 in vendor payments to 3 companies incorporated in the names of relatives of senior departmental personnel. $490 million in equipment purchases through a procurement channel that bypassed the city's standard bidding process. $340 million in expenses, reimbursements to 7 officers, including a captain and a lieutenant, for travel and accommodation that no departmental record supported, and $690,000 in transfers to a discretionary account controlled by the department's controller, whose disbursement records consisted of a single spreadsheet that had been manually altered at least 4 times. Among the 7 officers whose expense reimbursements appeared in the report were Officer Marcus Del Rey and Officer Jonathan Fettel. Among the senior personnel whose relatives appeared as principals of the vendor companies was Lieutenant Glenn Tabor. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit, which had been building its parallel investigation for 8 months, received a report within 2 hours of its submission to the Attorney General. Special Agent in Charge Deborah Asante had been briefed on the parking lot incident by Nana Adeyemi the same evening it occurred. She had filed an internal flag on the incident that same night, not publicly, not with any announcement, but into the record that was being built with the patient exact accumulation of documented facts. That is how federal cases actually get made. The parking lot incident, the unauthorized detention, the identity of the officers involved, and their subsequent appearance in the forensic report were now part of the same documented record. Federal arrest warrants were executed 41 days after the report's submission. Officers Marcus Del Rey and Jonathan Fettel were arrested at the Sandy Springs precinct at 7:14 a.m. on a Monday morning in November. Not in a parking lot, not without identification, not in handcuffs, applied while someone on the third floor filmed 11 seconds from a window, but in the full presence of federal authority, with warrants, with counsel present, and with the weight of 341 pages of forensic documentation behind every charge. Lieutenant Glenn Tabor was arrested at his home on Trowbridge Drive in Sandy Springs at 7:22 a.m. of the same morning. The department's controller was arrested at his office on Roswell Road at 7:31 a.m. 3 additional officers and 2 civilian employees received federal summonses by 9 a.m. The arrests were coordinated by the FBI's Public Corruption Unit in conjunction with the Georgia Attorney General's office. Kwadwo Osei-Mensah was not present for any of the arrests. It was in Suite 410 on the 4th floor of the Meridian Professional Center on Peachtree Dunwoody Road, where he arrived at 7 a.m. that Monday, as he arrived most Mondays, most Tuesdays, most days of the week, because there was a new engagement that had started the previous month, and the files were not going to examine themselves. Adaethe Owusu, the paralegal from the 3rd floor who had filmed 11 seconds and then called the office number and left a voicemail, was deposed as a witness in the civil proceedings that followed. She gave a statement that lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. The 11 seconds of footage were entered into evidence. She had not, she said, under questioning, known what would come of any of it when she made the call. She had simply known that watching and doing nothing was a version of participation she was not willing to accept. The civil settlement reached between the city of Sandy Springs and Kwadwo Osei-Mensah was $310,000, paid within 90 days of the federal charges being formally filed. Kwadwo directed $200 million of it to the Georgia Innocence Project, which provided pro bono legal services to wrongfully detained individuals in the state of Georgia. The remaining $110,000 he directed to a scholarship fund at Georgia State University's J. Mac Robinson College of Business for students pursuing forensic accounting, a discipline, as the scholarship's founding statement read, that existed specifically to make visible what powerful institutions prefer to keep hidden. Gerald Nwosu, his 26-year-old assistant who had executed the contingency protocol correctly on the evening of the arrest, received a formal letter of commendation and a pay increase of $14,000 annually, effective the following January. Kwadwo told him in a meeting that lasted 9 minutes that the difference between a firm that survived a crisis and a firm that was destroyed by one was whether the right person knew the right protocol and carried it out without being told to. Gerald said he had just done what the protocol said. Kwadwo said, "That is exactly what I mean." Nana Adeyemi, who had pulled over on Roswell Road at 5:58 p.m. on a Tuesday evening and made 3 phone calls in the correct order, continued as operations director of Meridian Forensic Associates. She did not consider what she had done unusual. She cited in a later interview that she had been trained by Kwadwo over 9 years to treat every contingency as something that had already been planned for. She said, "When you work for someone who thinks 14 moves ahead, you learn to think 14 moves ahead." The parking lot was move 3. Moves 4 through 14 had already been mapped. There is a kind of power that does not announce itself in parking lots. It does not carry itself in the price of a car or the cut of a jacket or the confidence of someone who has never needed to be careful. It carries itself in 341 pages of documented fact, in a sealed engagement letter from the Attorney General's office, in a contingency protocol reviewed every 6 months, In a server backup completed at 4:58 p.m. that afternoon. It looks, from the outside, like a man walking across 41 feet of asphalt to his car. It looks, in the back of a patrol car, like a man folding his hands on the table and waiting. It looks, from the third floor, like nothing special at all. And then it submits its report, and the report does what 41 years of careful building designed it to do. The people who decided that a man walking to his car in a parking lot was the correct target for a Tuesday afternoon stop were operating with a very specific and very expensive assumption that what they were looking at was less powerful than what they were. They were wrong by 341 pages. And the damage they tried to inflict in that parking lot, the 17 minutes with the identification running twice, the precinct room, the bolted table, the buzzing fluorescent, became, in the federal record, 3 additional line items on a list that was already very long. The world does not always recognize what it is standing in front of. Sometimes it puts what it is standing in front of in the back of a patrol car and drives it to a precinct. And the whole time it is doing that, the thing it is trying to stop is finishing the work. Some things cannot be taken by a patrol car, a precinct room, a badge, or the temporary authority of a Tuesday afternoon in a parking lot. Not the files, not the report, not the 11 days, not the 3 phone calls made from a car on the shoulder of Roswell Road by a woman who had already mapped 14 moves ahead, not the 341 pages that were waiting on a secured server, intact and inaccessible, while the handcuffs were still on. Leave your answer in the comments. If you had been a Diaz, the paralegal on the 3rd floor, not a lawyer, not connected, just someone who saw what happened through a window and had 11 seconds of footage on her phone, what would you have done with it? There are 1,000 ways to tell yourself it is not your problem. I want to know whether you would have found one of them or whether you would have made the call. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.